Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Ban, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, Platform for Experimental Collaborative Ethnography, a guided tour with Kim Fortun. I'd like us to begin with giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. Kim Fortun is a professor at the University of California, Irvine's Department of Anthropology, director of the EcoGovLab and Research Coordinator for the PECE Lab. Fortun is an interdisciplinary qualitative researcher specializing in comparative studies of environmental knowledge, injustice, and governance, and the first speaker in our series exploring how different disciplines within social sciences approach the question of data management. So thank you so much for joining us. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to put my link to my slides in the chat because there's a lot of links in the notes that correspond to what I'll share with you today. Okay, so I'm going to share with you, as was noted, our work to build what we've called the Platform for Experimental Collaborative Ethnography and PECE. And so building PECE in many different ways, we hope. PECE is software that supports virtual research environments. So there's many different PECE platforms, which I'll tell you about. So the PECE itself is the underlying software, and it supports research environments designed by and for qualitative researchers. I want to tell you a little bit about my backstory as a researcher to help you understand how I kind of walked into this project far from directly. So I was educated in cultural anthropology. I was in graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was a very, very theoretically vibrant time, which in some ways you would think would not, kind of turn me towards the design anthropology that I do so much of today. But I think there is one important thread in that early work, which in part brought literary theory into anthropology, made some people in the field very concerned about the textual architecture that carry the knowledge claims that we make. And in many ways, software is a form of textual architecture, not unlike that of an essay or a book. I started my research career at the site of the 1984 Union Carbide chemical plant disaster in Bhopal, India. I wasn't there in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, but 6 years later when the case was in the Supreme Court. So questions of representation, how do you represent harm in institutionalized arena like courts? And of course, not surprisingly, what I learned is that often things are just illegible. And so two things in this slide that I'll just note quickly. The center is the year of the Bhopal disaster was the release of the Apple Macintosh computer. So it was a period of high confidence and excitement that new information and communication technologies would usher in a new wave of democracy, new knowledge forms. And I would argue that in many ways it has, but of course, we're far from there. And so in the upper right-hand corner is the very crude information board that was used in Bhopal to search for survivors of the gas leak. And the inadequacy of that information infrastructure really has haunted me throughout my career, and I think is a through line that leads me to the work to build research data infrastructure today. I've also followed environmental disasters and harms in the US and some other places, but often my research is not so much on the lived environments where that are impacted, but by the people trying to represent those environments. And so what you see on the right is this is early use of GIS to show the distribution of environmental harm. So again, it's a very creative data work, has been the focus of my ethnographic analysis and eventually drew me into its practice. So what you see here is each red circle is a industrial facility in the city of Houston that has the potential for a worst case offsite release of chemicals. So that's really the kill zone is the red circle, and each of the blue dots are schools. And so it's really an effort to kind of show the vulnerability of schools to petrochemical harms. So again, it's this kind of creative data work I've studied and come to be very inspired by. I've also studied the development of digital information systems and data capacity in the environmental regulatory arena, like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and also in the environmental health sciences. So what you see on the right is a virtual research environment that allows toxicologists to work with their data in new and creative ways. And there's links to these in the slides and to the other things I've referred to. So I just want to give you a sense that the work we do in the qualitative sciences to build our data infrastructure, we've got neighbors. There's people sitting side by side from us that we can learn from and collaborate with. And then the last note of my research background that's led very directly to the development of PECE is comparative studies of environmental governance that linked geographically distributed sites and researchers. So when we first started doing this project, which was part of a larger project that we called the asthma files, the researchers that were trying to collaborate, we were carrying around our data on flash drives and just kind of handing it back and forth. This was before Google Folders were even really a research resource. So we just didn't have a place to put things, much less collaboratively analyze things. And that's really what led to our initial investment in building PECE. And so there is a through line from my very early work at the site of the Bhopal disaster to the work I do today, trying to build digital workspace, collaborative workspace, both for qualitative researchers working among themselves, but also to support collaborations with the communities that we study and work alongside. So the beginnings of PECE, as I mentioned, were with the asthma files in an attempt to support our own collaborative practice. Fairly early, we realized that what we were building could become a community resource, that there was a wide need for it among people interested in both in more collaboration, but also in creative forms of research expression, what over time came to be thought of as multimodal anthropology or multimedia scholarly publishing. And we also realized very early on that we needed to learn as much as we could from other people, because we certainly we didn't have the technical background that we needed to do this. So we joined an organization called the Research Data Alliance, which supports open data sharing within and across disciplines. And it's organized around what they call domain groups. And so we were an empirical humanities domain group, and there were toxicology groups, there was a wheat science group, there were urban planning kinds of groups, but a lot of natural and physical sciences. But the other type of group were technical people that spent all of their time doing figuring out what good metadata look like or data provenance. And so we really were able to watch and learn a lot in this alliance, trying to bring that into the work we did to build research for infrastructure for qualitative researchers. So this is what we've ended up with. So the PECE platform itself is software. And now the PECE Lab, which is based where I am at the University of California, Irvine, we run 5 different instances of PECE. So these different platforms, the asthma files, the disaster STS network, STS infrastructures, Center for Ethnography, and a site called World PECE, which supports research to figure out what peace needs to be. And so each of these, it's really, imagine it as supporting different research communities. So each platform has many projects on it. The Center for Ethnography, for example, is not topically delimited. It's really people experimenting with new ethnographic methods, modes of expression, et cetera. STS Infrastructure supports a transnational network of researchers in the interdisciplinary social science field of science and technology studies. And we run all of these different platforms, both because we're in those communities and wanted to help infrastructure, but also we learn what peace needs to be by actually working on these platforms. So it's definitely a project where we're building the ship as we sail it, with all of the entropy or chaos sometimes that entails, but it does mean it's very grounded in the actual practice of qualitative researchers and our workflows and the types of data that we use. PECE has also been, you can download PECE yourself and install your own instance of it. That's a heavier technical lift than using a corner of one of the platforms that we run for a project. Researchers are in, there's an open call for collaboration where people can ask for space on one of the projects that we run. These here are when, for various reasons, research groups or centers had a need for their own instance of PECE. The University of Hamburg, for example, is running an instance of PECE that serves across their university. The Energy Rights Project needed their own platform, in part because of what they promised their funder they would do in terms of building an open data resource. Okay, so when PECE is used to support all of these different platforms, it travels with a certain design logic. So it's not kind of an empty space, it's a structured space. And so what you see here is the many different projects, but that the structuration cuts across them. And that structuration has really been the work of the PECE design group, trying to figure out what epistemic premises we wanted to build into the project, because we knew well that software and other structuring systems are never value neutral. And so we work largely in a theoretical tradition shaped by post-structuralism, post-colonialism, feminist epistemology. So we've tried to translate what we've learned from those intellectual traditions into design principles. So for example, explanatory pluralism, which has been parsed and celebrated in feminist epistemology, is an explicit design goal when we were building the project, to support explanatory pluralism rather than a kind of monolithic knowledge form. So PECE's design logics travel with the platform, and part of the research we do on PECE is to figure out how these design logics need to be either elaborated or how we can do a better job actually building them into the system. Let's see. Okay, so just a couple notes on PECE politics. There are many dimensions to this. I'll just mention two. I think one important promise of PECE is that it can help make space in scholarly domains for a greater diversity of people, in part giving space and voice to scholars from the global South, because it allows for collaboration across geography. You can make collaborations deeper from the very beginning, and so that your collaborators aren't just joining an already codified project, but are actually formative in the project design itself. And so what you're looking at here, and there's a link to the article in the slides, is a piece by Leandro Rodriguez Medina, just showing the extent to which North American and European scholarly voices kind of dominate the space. And so PECE is designed to kind of push back against this. This is another aspects of peace politics. What you see here is a schematic of the academic knowledge production process. And the article that this comes from is makes a sobering case that this whole process has been increasingly monopolized by commercial corporate providers. And so there's a corporatization of the infrastructure that academics use that PECE is also designed to push against in being open source software that's freely accessible, that's not overdetermined by these kinds of commercial valences. I'll now tell you a little bit about the structure of PECE itself. We think of PECE as a triptych, and so allowing for archiving of different kinds of data, and mostly qualitative data, so video, text, PDFs. It can support, you can archive tabular data, spreadsheets and things. It's not designed to do quantitative analysis within the platform, but it's also possible to kind of run a different system side by side and do the qualitative analysis of that tabular data inside PECE. The middle column here is analyzing. I think the belly and the kind of guts of PECE is making space for collaborative analysis. And that's really what we wanted when we first designed PECE. We wanted more than one of us to be able to look at and think together with different pieces of data. And of course, to do that, you had to have a place to put it. So the archive kind of came second, but the analyzing space was dependent on that. And then on the right, you see the way that PECE allows for creative modes of scholarly articulation. It can be, there's multimedia possibilities, and I'll show you some examples of what we've done with it. So this is what just in PECE's archiving functionality, this is what it looks like when I go to add content to PECE. So this is every user that's registered for a platform has a dashboard, and you just have an option to add various kinds of data, and then to configure them in different ways. Like once you add a set of PDFs and JPEGs, for example, you could very easily and quickly configure them as a timeline or a photo essay, or I'll show you something like a collage of kind of format. And so we use the different formats not only at the end of research to share it in an outward facing way, but also to organize it for us to look at in the process of a research project. Okay, this is what the analytic mode of PECE looks like. And so what PECE supports is you can add question sets to PECE. And so what you're seeing on the left is some of the question sets that are in the platform, the disaster STS instance of PECE. In the middle, what you see is what one of those question sets would look like. And so this is a question set for analyzing a data resource, like a environmental protection agency, environmental justice mapping tool. And so each researcher could go in and answer these questions. And then if you click on the question, you can see different people's responses. So you can very collaboratively build your analysis. And you can see that on the right side of the screen here. And this is just another example of being able to what we've called collaborative hermeneutics, kind of looking at things together. And what you're seeing here is an analytic framework we've developed to actually evaluate PECE projects, so that we can use PECE to actually evaluate how PECE is being used by different project groups. So this section on PECE as publishing, I'll show you a few examples of how we've used move from archiving through analysis to actually publishing scholarly results. So in this slide, what you see is each on the left is each of those, the panes in that view is a research group from someplace around the world that was recounting the history of the field of science and technology study in their region. And they built collections that included, founding documents of departments, important papers that shaped the field, interviews with practitioners of the field. So each of those was very data rich. This was then used to create a poster exhibit at the conference, which had an incredibly lively effect. I mean, it really stimulated cross-region dialogue. And then now the journal Engaging Science and Technology Studies has published a set of traditional journal articles, but using the digital archive that was built for this project as the back end, meaning what in some fields, it's increasingly expected that researchers publish their source or supplemental data, not yet common in the qualitative sciences. But this journal is using PECE to infrastructure the attachment of source and supplemental data to a journal article. This is a use of PECE to publish student work. So everything you see here, all of the county names, is an environmental justice case study report produced by lower division undergraduate students. And one thing that's been really encouraging is that publishing their research so that the communities they study can access it has an incredibly motivating and empowering effect on young students. So that's been a really kind of nice use of the platform. And this is the Formosa Plastics Global Archive, which is where the archive itself is the publication. And what this archive, and I have a number of slides on the archive to give you a sense of really what PECE looks like in process. So Formosa Plastics is a Taiwanese based petrochemical company with operations around the world. And over the last 5 years or so, there's an increasing awareness among the activists working in these various sites that they needed to be better connected and working collaboratively, in part because when Formosa tries to cite a plant in Louisiana in the US, for example, if they win their fight to not let Formosa come to town, it often gets shifted to another site where Formosa already has operations. So this archive was designed to support and connect distributed community-based organizations working in response to Formosa Plastics. And it's rendered in different parts of it in English, Mandarin, and Vietnamese, where there's Formosa operations. On the left, what you see what we call the project page for the Formosa archive. And this is where a research group can keep up with everything, your proposal documents, your ethics approvals, your interview protocols. It's kind of the back end of the project. On the right side, you see the public-facing portal to the Formosa archive. And this archive is organized around places. So there's each of the places that you see here. You click through to a set of collections for each of those places. So it's very data rich. And I'll show you a little what that looks like. So this is the collections for Calhoun County, Texas, where there's a huge Formosa operation. And the activist you see in the foreground, Diane Wilson, recently won a landmark citizen suit against Formosa Plastics for plastic pellet pollution. It's very, very exciting. The proceeds from that lawsuit are now being used to try and rebuild the local fishing industry, which of course has to work against climate, the extremes of climate change on the Texas Gulf Coast, against new industry coming into the region. And so what you see on the right is the different kinds of collections that has been built for the Formosa Archive. And the lead researcher for the Formosa Archive is an anthropologist named Tim Schutz, who has spent his career building data infrastructure for vulnerable communities. And he's really the kind of design lead on all of this, working closely with Diane Wilson. And so what you see is the way that we've moved from her file cabinets to work with her to select data that she's kept over many years that deserves to be preserved in a digital archive that can be referred to in just for historical and ethnographic study of these places, but also to support activist work. And so what you see on in the lower panes is what it looks like to upload documents as these are both PDFs. We've also, Diane had interviews with workers from the 1990s that she had, on her hard drive. And so we've added the interviews with workers that she collected. And as you see, we have a way to attribute her. And so one thing we've learned is to support collaboration, you have to develop standardized citation practices, ways of attributing, so that collaboration doesn't strip away the credit people deserve for their work. This is the collection that we've built with Diane to document the lawsuit that is a model for other groups pursuing environmental justice. And this is an example of how the archive, like many of our projects, the digital archive has been linked to analog events. So in this, there's a photo essay in the Formosa archive of court drawings from a case in Taiwan. A sociologist who attended the court proceedings made these really quite incredible drawings. And they were again sitting on his hard drive. So we pulled them into the archive, but in order to use them to animate community deliberation, the archive was then replayed in a small gallery in Taipei, where the items in the archive were printed and made available for discussion. And what you're seeing here is the presentation of the archive in this analog format. And then last, an important part of this project is building virtual toxic tours that literally take attendees or participants in a tour to the various sites that we're trying to connect. And one thing that's been very rewarding to see is just in organizing the tours, which have been very well attended, it's actually helped build the connections between the sites that was the original motivation for the archive. So I'm near to closing, and I just wanted note just a couple of big picture aims that we have in building and working with PECE. Including just multiplying the frames through which people can see and make sense of the world, building a rich repertoire of examples and images to think with, supporting what Gregory Bateson called deutero-learning, a recursive capacity to understand our context, and helping people invest in new forms of collectivity for problem solving. And this slide I'll just go over quickly, but I'll acknowledge that there is a lot of worry about research data sharing in the qualitative sciences for many different reasons. History of extractive relations with the communities we study, concern about the malicious use of the data or poorly contextualized use, just the sheer labor of it. And so if you're interested in the details, this you can return to this in the slides. But there's also a slide that says, why should we share anyway? And so I think one of the things that we've learned through building and working with PECE is that the research data sharing has been incredibly vitalizing methodologically. I mean, we've learned to think about and be creative about how we design and carry out our research because we're archiving as we go, so to speak. There are continuing research questions that involved in sustaining PECE. So it's certainly not a finished product that we just operate. Some of the questions that you see here, in the qualitative sciences, for example, like what are our workflows? Like, because if you're going to try and digitally infrastructure them, you have to express them in the way data scientists would talk about it, in a way that's not habitual in the field. What do we not want the systems to do? We're constantly asking that question. And so I'll close by pointing you here. And there's a link to PECE tutorials that you can, if you really want to get your hands into seeing how PECE works. It runs on the World PECE instance of the platform, and it takes you through both practical functionality, but also some of the kind of wraparounds, things like how you choose what kind of license to use. We use a suite of Creative Commons licensing. And so all of that is kind of bundled into these tutorials. And so I'll just end by saying there's an open call for collaborations, which means we really welcome your ideas on what PECE needs to become. If you're possibly interested in using PECE, we can follow up with you. And I think of it often as moving from experimental ethnography, which has been the tradition I've worked in since the beginning of my career, to archive ethnography as the kind of latest iteration of what experimental ethnography can become. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I'll give everyone a couple minutes to think of questions and start off with my own. So inviting you here was part of a process that we at Spark have been going through in trying to look across all of the disciplines of social science and really think about what RDM looks like in this context. And I think one of the things in reading your work and the work of many others in anthropology that we were really struck by was exactly what you said. Replication isn't the goal. We know replication isn't the goal. And so how to think about the central why of engaging in these practices. And I was really struck by your the idea that when you have these sort of deep archives, it allows for the evolving interpretation and the interpretation by so many different voices and parties. And that, to me, when I think about sort of what the goals of feminist research and other sort of positive research is, that's the heart of it. And so I guess to start, thank you, because I didn't think I had a handle until I listened to you on why this is so important within qualitative research and how to hang the hat of why this matters.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you have any more to say about that or thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. So one thing I'll note is, again, I've learned a lot from work watching other scientific fields develop data management practices and data infrastructure. And one thing I've written a little bit about is in toxicology, they have these very expensively produced like rodent data sets. And they have realized over time that, if you develop new analytic techniques to look at those studies, you just might see something different. New software tools are developed for them. I mean, they analyze it in different ways. And the idea that especially as hermeneutes, for us to think that our data only deserves one set of eyes or interpretations at one historical moment, it's really out of step with what we know about knowledge and interpretation. And so the other thing is that it does, thinking of interpretive or hermeneutic expansion as a goal is in tension with a way that some people talk about data management, which is reproducibility. Like you share your data so someone go in and check to see if you were valid. And, you know, that's not crazy. We should be able to evidence our claims. On the other hand, I think that's a small part of what we do through collaboration and even peer review, but the idea that you want for interpretations to be elaborated, questioned, extended, taken in a different direction. And so I think the reproducibility language actually doesn't do justice to what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. I'm putting in the chat a link to an article that recently came out in Field of Sociology that had, I think it was 161 researchers replicate the same study, and recognizing the intensity of the difference in choices around analytical methods and then their ultimate results. And so I think we are really at sort of the beginning of the understanding of how profound all of that is to our understanding of data, and how critical this kind of infrastructure for people to be able to bring different lenses to it is for the future of how we get to better evidence. All right, other questions, comments, things that people would like to talk with Kim about?
Did you put that article in the chat?
Oh, yeah, I'm just about to.
Okay.
If you're open to it, Isaac or Danica, I'd love to hear from you. So they are very dedicated research data management team at the library, who are working across every discipline around this, and have been wonderful partners with us in trying to think through what data management looks like within the social sciences.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. Can you hear me okay? Oh man.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for this. This was an incredible presentation, and it's really great to see some of the this software being built specifically for ethnography and qualitative data. I guess my question was just going to be, I think the examples you showed look like they were like people who were okay being identified. And so I wonder if you can share a little bit about sharing or like sensitive data and how you kind of deal with data security and when you share those kind of things, roles and permissions.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I should not have omitted that because it's a huge concern for many qualitative researchers. And you're right that most of our studies, we don't have subjects at high risk. And that's an important reason we need to run lots of projects, because we do have projects on the platforms that have very, very serious security concerns. So on the platform, it is customized to allow different kinds of restrictions on data availability. So you can upload something that only you can see, and it won't even come up in a search for like you won't even see a no access link. You can delimit it to a small group, like a dissertation researcher and their advisor or committee, or 4 of us working on a project, or 20 of us working on a project. Or you can open it to the whole platform, but not to the wide world. Most of the platforms are so busy that it's a pretty wide world. I mean, if you've got security concerns, that would not be very restricted. And then there's fully open. And nicely, it's easy to toggle between those. So you can, when you first collect data and you hadn't even figured out who can see it, if you just get it in there, as I'm sure you know, as a librarian, is that it's really hard to go backwards and actually properly archive your stuff. And so if you get in the habit of, and just restrict it until you have time to think about it, that's been a really important function for us. Something else I'll put in the mix that is well, and also we're about to have a major platform upgrade that actually smooths this process, because it's right now, it's like if you attach something to a research group, is it, oh, you can restrict it, yeah, to a group. And so anyway, I mean, it's been challenging to figure out that navigation, which we're hopefully about to improve. But on a kind of different note, with the libraries, currently our platforms run on servers in our School of Social Science. I think it would be much, much better for them to be run inside and in partnership with libraries, because libraries know how to do that. And one thing, we've just been in the University of California system for a little under 5 years, and we assume that the California Digital Library, which is cross campus for the whole UC system, would be ready for this kind of work. But at this point, they really only want our stuff when it's not lively anymore, when it's like done. And it's like, sorry, like what we need is open space.
See, we've got a comment from Shahad in the notes. Still digesting all of what has been shared. Have you experienced any challenges with buy-in from researchers or difficulties with training folks to use this?
There are certainly many people that resist data sharing in the qualitative sciences. And often it's, they think that the only data they have is their field notes, which field notes usually should not be broadly shared, although there's a way you could keep a thread of field notes that will at least be somewhat shareable. But there's lots of other data that we, in fact, use. But I think that at core, I mean, I'm pretty critical of the resistance, because I think it comes from a landlord sense of being a scholar. Like, it's mine, I'm not going to share it because you can make me. And so thinking of our scholarship as property in those terms, I really think is one, just has no grounds. But it really limits how knowledge can be produced, because, as Allison said at the outset, it's like, it doesn't do justice to the material for only one set of eyes to be working with it. And the other thing, another way people sometimes respond is they see this as like technical, and like their work is like the substantive stuff or something. And I've also gotten really impatient with that, because these are the same people who would say that the structure of a text matters. And yet the structure of our knowledge infrastructure is just technical, and we'll leave it to, a bunch of techies in a cave. It just, again, it doesn't follow. And so not seeing this work as political, which I think it's just naive not to see the politics of it.
I have a question related to that. I do a lot of work with clients in the community. And so we've been having a lot of conversations about the fact that whenever we're doing qualitative data analysis, we're using software that they don't have access to.
Mm-hmm.
And it really frustrates me. Or we're actively trying to engage them, and so we're doing kind of crazy coding in Word and Excel. So can you talk a little bit about the analysis part, and sort of what are the capacities, what are the limits of what people can do in terms of what you think of as sort of classic qualitative data analysis, coding, garbage theory, that kind of stuff?
So the platform does not support coding like, say, Atlas TI does. It doesn't, you can't annotate, like if you have a PDF, you can't attach a comment to a certain line. And to some extent that was purposeful, because we were looking to infrastructure. We didn't use Atlas TI before we did this research. So like, what is it we actually do? And so what it's built around is these shared question sets, where instead of where you bring questions to data, like what is the kind of, what discourses are used to frame and describe kind of this phenomenon. And so in that, individual researchers add qualitative or text commentary. One way we've used it with community groups is it's easy to register them, and it's not a high learning curve for them to actually annotate themselves. So what we call annotation is like responding to a question. So they can join the mix. But often in the community partnerships that we have, they talk it out at us, and then we put it into that framework, and so help them visualize what they've shared in an analytic frame. And often that gives them a language for what they know, like a meta language for what they know, that both is grounds for the collaboration, I think gives them a sense of knowledge authority. And just a great example is we have like a 10-question environmental justice framework that we use to characterize environmental justice in different settings. And it's, if you think of the 10 questions, they prompt analysis, but it's also information architecture. Like, where do you put all the information about social vulnerabilities? Where do you put all the information about chemical and physical hazards? Where do you put all the information about the stakeholders and where they diverge and concur on claims? And so it's like each question is almost like a bucket for you to put material in, so people can find things better. You can constantly add things to those buckets. So some of the collaboration it supports is analog, but the digital aspects infrastructure that analog exchange.
Thank you. I want to respect that we're at time, so if people have to leave, feel free. But there was one more question in the chat from Isaac, who's talking about the challenges around sustainability of these kinds of open source research software projects, and what continuity looks like for PECE, and how you think about the maintenance aspect.
We worry about that quite a lot, but also have tried to plan for that. So one, PECE is a very highly customized instance or version of a Drupal content management system. And we moved to Drupal many years ago now from another open source content management system, in part because the Drupal development community is so strong worldwide. So to a certain extent, they have our backs at the, kind of underneath what PECE is. And then we, the PECE design group that really kind of guides software development, we are really fortunate to have a software developer, a Brazilian software developer named Renato, who has made a huge difference, because like he understands and believes in the project. It means that we have to constantly raise money to support him. And we've done that occasionally, bringing in money for PECE itself, but more often having a budget line that's in one of the content projects. Like an environmental justice project would have. I just brought in some money for PECE through a curriculum grant to develop environmental justice literacy things, and we just built in a layer for PECE. But it's there should be more direct funding for infrastructure like this. There's not yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think it's likely to be a lot of conversation ongoing about this, and if there were opportunities here at McMaster to use PECE, I think there's likely to be a great deal of interest. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. And, an easy way to just see if PECE might be a good resource for you is just to build a little space on one of the existing platforms, rather than thinking that you have to kind of install a whole one on your own. And so if any of you are interested in that, let me know and we'll try to figure out how to support it.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful day.